So we start off in a field where a bunch of kids are dancing around the local ginger, who's wondering why their blonde friend is sitting on a rock by herself and being all antisocial. Then they warn her that a swan-shaped paper boat ain't gonna float, and they all start randomly chucking rocks at it when it does, which makes her lose her shit and almost decks this kid's lights out. Luckily though, her older brother, who has the squarest jaw I've ever seen outside of a Pixar movie, stops her from dishing out some toxic femininity and calms her down by chatting some shit about a stone and a ship. Turns out that was a flashback, and the softly spoken British female narrator gives a giant expo dump of how the elves went to war with Morgoth in Middle-earth after he destroyed their tree lights or something. And I can totally relate. I remember when my neighbour Ted pulled down our Christmas decorations last year because he was jealous of our extravagant display, and we went to war by pushing his bins slightly further down the street. Anyway, turns out Morgoth was defeated, but his orcs had spread under his servant Sauron, who ended up killing the narrator's brother and giving him a giant tramp stamp. So she took up his mission to destroy Sauron, but no one could find him, so they apparently just gave up and assumed he was dead. Not a joke. But the narrator doesn't believe it because she's determined and headstrong, and only a slight bit scarily obsessive, and so is still on that very mission to avenge her brother by killing some soy boy with a trident head who may or may not even still exist. After climbing up some giant frozen cliff in what is clearly a green screen studio set, it's revealed that the narrator is a lady called Galadriel, aka Master of the Resting Bitch Face Championships, and an elf who apparently commands a group of buddies who don't even seem to believe in the cause. But luckily they are totally irrelevant and don't even get a name in the script, as when they encounter a giant cave troll she takes it out almost single-handedly, after jumping off a sword with the most piss-poor wirework since anything on the CW Supergirl. Tired, hungry and totally emasculated, her merry band of elves all abandon her crazy vendetta that seems to keep bringing them to the brink of death, and then we crash straight into the main credit sequence, which is super disappointing because it's just a lame title card for this epi. So after this 20-minute introduction, yes literally, we meet the crazy and zany Harfords, who are basically a nomadic bunch of hobos and straight up rip-offs of hobbits, but Amazon can't call them that for legal reasons. These lot all speak with dodgy Irish accents because reasons, and it's here that we meet gender swap Frodo, what looks like she rolled out of bed with a bird's nest in her hair. Apparently it's because they have to camouflage themselves to hide at short notice. Yeah, I've heard that before. Buy a hairbrush, a cheap git. Anyway, they come across and quickly scoff a load of berries, and before this gender flip Samwise Gamgee fella can stuff them all, they have to hide from a nearby wolf. But more excitingly, we now get our first glimpse of the elf kingdom of Lindon, and one of the main characters in the show. This pretty boy is called Elrond, who in the movies was played with the gravitas of Hugo Weaving, whereas here he's played with all the gravitas of blancmange. Anyway, here he meets up with Budget Kate Blanchett with Perpetual PMT, who initially start conversing in their native Elvish until both actors can't be fucked anymore and they go back to the King's English. She wants to speak to the King directly so she can get back out there after all her friends dumped her for almost making them become troll food, but Elrond gets her to agree to stay and cool off for a bit. Later, the elf leader bloke declares the war is over now that she's returned, and thus they're all going back home to Valinor. I think. I was a little distracted by the Harry Potter style fireworks and the constant cutaways to this Elrond fella, who has the flattest face in all of Elfland. Geezer looks like he fell face first between a sandwich presser. But anyway, this elfy flat-faced fella tries to convince this Galadriel bird to go home with him and not stay to be an outcast in this Middle-earth dump. And she seems to relent. Or maybe she's just constipated. Whoa, the acting is so good I can't really tell. Anyway, now we're introduced to the Southlands by a handy title graphic. Apparently, this is the kingdom of men, and you can tell because there's a load of smelly mucky blokes populating the local pub who speak like working-class Yorkshiremen, which treads the line of being borderline racist. It's here that we meet Arondir, who's somehow the first black elf in all of Tolkien land and looks weirdly like Yankee news host Don Lemon for some reason. And the humans clearly have major beef with the elf race. Not sure why, but I'm guessing it has something to do with this guy walking around giving everyone evils and like he has an arrow permanently shoved up his arse. Anyway, Don Lemon with one facial expression seems to have a thing with a white woman in the town who's out by the wishing well washing her kecks. And he goes over to flirt with her for a bit whilst never once moving his brow. When his people tell him they're leaving to go back to Valinor, the geezer seems reluctant. So he goes back into Chavtown to tell his floozy that there ain't going to be any more saucy shenanigans now he's sodding off home. Whilst there, we also meet a young boy called Theo, who sounds like he's from Leeds but looks like he's from the Philippines. Apparently, he's her son from a previous relationship, and before you can say what the fuck, they get distracted by some farmer whose cow is leaking black guns from her teats. I got off with a girl who had that problem once, though apparently she just needed to eat more veggies and stop drinking Dr. Pepper all day. But anyway, the loved up secret lovers set off to a place called Hordern to investigate this malarkey. While he's off, this Theo kid pulls out some sort of talisman thing, what looks a bit like that pointy head guy who tramp-stamped Galadriel's brother to death. Speaking of, she's now sailing away toward Valinor in the high and sundering seas whilst doing that Titanic thing and enjoying the breeze, as we're introduced to an elf prince called Lord Cerebrimbor who does and says fuck all, whilst the first black elf and his squeeze arrive to find Hordern in flames. Oh, the skies part as the entrance to Valinor opens, but the blonde elf gets literal cold feet after suffering flashbacks to her long dead brother reminding her that her business is still not finished in Middle-earth. And so she has second thoughts and totally jumps off the boat with no dry clothes, no equipment, and no fucking plan on how to get back to shore. Then a leaf turns black back at the elf kingdom of Lindon, which I guess is supposed to be some ominous portent of doom and not meant to imply he's recently milked one of those Gunty cows or something. As gender-swap Frodo finds a nudie naked man curled up in a fiery crater, and the camera pulls back in an aerial shot to make it look like the Eye of Sauron. And that's it, that's episode 1. Amazing what 60 million big ones will buy you. Apparently, anything but more than one facial expression. Anyway, on to episode 2. Finally, a proper title sequence. Of some vibrating sand for some reason. And a completely unmemorable, unhummable theme tune, even though it's the most expensive show money can buy. I mean, Buffy had a better theme tune than this, and that was 20 years ago and made by a band named after some alien cattle. So we start with the underwater cameraman perving up Galadriel's skirt, because why not? And then we rise above the water to see the blonde girl boss elf alone and adrift in the middle of the sea, after jumping off a perfectly good boat because she still hasn't processed her grief about that spiky-haired fella tramp-stamping her bro to Kingdom Come. Anyway, she floats around for a bit like a giant turd in the English Channel. Not a joke. They're literally pumping sewage into our coast now because nobody cares about anything, the West is totally collapsing. Who then swims off in a completely random direction, hoping it's the way back to shore. Back at the fiery crater where we last left the gender-flipped half-foots what totally ain't hobbits for legal reasons, the fat one chucks her mate down to the nudie naked guy where she realises the fire isn't even hot because reasons. Then, like any red-blooded fella, he smells a bit of pussy and wakes up with a raging lob on, and proceeds to scream in her face with what has to be one of the world's worst case of morning breath because it blows the fucking twigs out her hair. After hauling his lazy fat ass back up to their camp, female Frodo insists that because he landed in front of them where he could have landed anywhere, it must mean that he's important or something. I mean, if you say so, girl. So we then rejoin the first Black Don Lemon with one facial expression, who's investigating the burning city of Alden with his naughty missus, and find a secret passage that someone, or something, dug under the town. And he tells her to go back and warn everybody, whilst he prepares to fit himself into a tight black hole. Nah, too easy. Then we're treated to majestic sweeping shots of a gorgeous city called Eregion, which I thought was a movie what flopped back in '06. And we cut to the flat-faced elfie fella stroking the shaft of a long and solid tool. Fuck's sake, show. Turns out he's talking with Lord Calamari, who wants Captain Flatface to build a few towers by the spring. But in order to do that, he needs a workforce who can totally get a grift on. So they hot tally it over to some place called Khazad Dûm, which according to the handy on-screen graphic is the realm of the dwarves. Here they ask to seek a meeting with Prince Durin, but they won't let him in because these little fellas hate elves apparently. So Commander Flatface invokes the right of something called Sigyn Tarag, just to get through the front door. Turns out this is essentially a pissing contest with a bunch of dwarves, which are nearly as tall as him to be fair, to see who can smash up the biggest rock. And fuck me, that's a lot of dwarves. They must have cast every little one in Auckland. Elsewhere, Budget Elijah Wood with a bird's nest in her hair politely walks up to a new strange friend and simply says hello. And he proceeds to instantly scream into her face again and blows all the birds out of her bushy barnet because reasons. Funnily enough, this sequence reminds me of that scene in episode 1 of The She-Hulk where she practically did the same thing.
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, remind me never to say howdy to great hulking beings with attitude problems. Anyway, in an attempt to form a bond, she tells him about how she fell out of a tree once and for a whole week she kept calling strawberries pigberries and then just laughs it off. So after casually making fun of concussions for cheap laughs, she tells him her name is actually Nori and not Budget Elijah Wood with a bird's nest in her hair after all, and proceeds to lick her fingers like a tramp behind the KFC bins after eating a bunch of bugs. I didn't know they invited Klaus Schwab to script a scene for this show. Then, after an incredible 27 minutes, we finally cut back to that dopey blonde elf, what totally intentionally marooned herself amidst a giant fuck-off ocean, and is eventually found by a life raft full of stinky humans and what seems to be a Calvin Klein model for some reason, and most are initially hesitant to let her on. But luckily, a stunning and brave brown lady displays a bit of humanity, before one of the blokes lifts up Galadriel's spotted hair and mocks her deformed auricular monstrosities. And before they can chuck her off for her gross yet immutable characteristics, the group gets attacked by some sort of water worm what comes out of the literal blue. Now, most of the stinky humans get eaten, as does the stunning and brave brown lady unfortunately, but luckily the random Calvin Klein model miraculously survives, because plot armour. Back at the dwarvy stonemason pissing contest, Elrond gives up and concedes defeat to budget Jonathan Rhys-Davies. Asking to be escorted out by the contest victor Prince Durin, the pair then stand on a lift and have the most passive-aggressive Barney since literally any scene from Sex and the City back in the day. Apparently, Budget Gimli is hurt that Elrond didn't come to see him more often and missed out on all his big life events, whereas Elrond is flabbergasted, because elves live so long he felt like he just saw the tiny geezer the other day. Or maybe he just recently rewatched the OG Lord of the Rings trilogy and simply got mixed up. Anyway, he apologises for making him feel that way and congratulates him on the act of procreation. He then asks to apologise directly to Durin's wife Dina, and we're then introduced to the first female dwarf without a beard in all of Lord of the Rings lore. LOL! Who just happens to be black and speaks with a dodgy Scottish accent, also because reasons. So they stay for dinner and heal the old wounds, and Durin eventually agrees to hear Elrond's proposal. Back on the raft in the middle of nowhere, Calvin Klein states that his name is not actually Calvin Klein but Halbrand, and a bunch of orcs destroyed his homeland. Then Don Lemon's current squeeze arrives back in the Southlands, where she attempts to warn the grimy Yorkshiremen that they're all in grave danger because she found a big hole and sent a black man down into it, or something like that. They don't believe her though and practically go full twit-tard by demanding she cite her sources. And then her son Theo hears some rustling under the floorboards in the barn where he keeps that talisman of a legit Dark Lord and somehow laughably ends up thinking it's just mice. Meanwhile, the elfy archer guy strains to give us that all-coveted second facial expression by trying to simulate fear and distress as shadows of orcs begin chasing him down the tunnel. Back at the barn, Arondir's Floozy gets attacked by a monstrous creature, which turns out to be our first look at the fearsome orcs. What are so powerful he manages to get taken out in under 2 minutes by a 12-year-old Filipino boy and his clueless mum. I mean, what an introduction! Bruh. Then she slams the orc's severed head down on the table in the town pub and screams, "How's that for a fucking sauce?" Anyway, on the high seas, Gladys and her pretty boy are riding out in the midst of a horrific storm, which totally doesn't look like it was filmed in a moderately sized aquatank out in Cali. And because this brainlet had the smart idea to tie herself to the mast, which just got her knocked overboard and is now sinking, so is she bloody sinking too. Until this toxic white saviour has to jump into the freezing ocean to save her, where he reaches into her drawers and pulls out a sword to cut the ropes and return her silly ass to the surface. Then the strange giant nudie guy who can't speak a word of English frees a bunch of fireflies what the evil Harfoots have locked up to use as lanterns, and appears to be talking to him like he's auditioning for a Dr. Dolittle reboot. They seem to form a constellation in the sky, but then they start dropping dead as the light goes out in their arse cheeks. Prince Durin and his dad King Durin discuss Elrond and his motives, advising careful thought and caution, and then open a chest with glowing light, but we don't get to see what's inside because this is only episode 2, so they proceed to tease us harder than an overpriced hooker in Soho. Then Theo takes out the talisman thing and a drop of his blood is sucked into it like a giant magnet and starts sparking hotter than a Democrat in a church. Then he just seems to stick the flaming hot sparkling item into his bag of possessions and joins his community while leaving the town. And then we end on the image of age-old Gladys and her toy boy having a cheeky kip on the raft, as some menacing shadows annoyingly get in the way of their sunbathing. And that's it, that's episode 2. Almost there, guys. Now on to episode 3. We start with the first black elf who's overdosed on Botox being slung into a labour camp. which is not a place where everyone lobbies for Keir Starmer, but in fact a soul-destroying place full of disgusting and rude creatures. Actually, it does sound pretty close to the Labour Party. Anyway, then budget Kate Blanchett with constant constipation wakes up and stuffs down some porridge without doing any basic checks as to whether it's actually poison or not, and realises she's stuck on a boat with a bunch of hunky men. And unlike a normal woman who would be thanking her lucky stars and thinking all her Christmases had come at once, she gets all defensive and gives him 20 questions with an uncalled for attitude. That is until she catches a glimpse of his sword poking out through his trousers. Again, too easy. So then they sail on a clear and obvious green screen to somewhere called the Island Kingdom in Numenor, a place full of a load of houses perched up on cliffs and looks like a fucking death trap to any poor sod what buys a gaff there. Good luck taking a shit at times of high tide. So they get off the boat, what seems to be being rowed by knockoff Spock for some reason, and budget Kate Blanchett with chronic constipation steps into the main hall looking like she's just walked out of St. Maud. Boy was she on fire in that movie. The human queen leader lady asks her who she is, and the resting bitch-face champion proceeds to go through her full name and title.
Galadriel of the Noldor, daughter of the Golden House of Finarfin, commander of the northern armies of High King Gil-galad.
All Gladders to you! Anyway, she asks for a ship's passage to Middle-earth, but they're shocked because they all fell out with the elves years ago. But luckily, she goes about healing the wounds like a totally sane person by speaking down to them with the world's most patronising tone. And she's so rude, her human male buddy has to step in to calm things down and negotiate peaceful resolutions, as she's too smug and arrogant to even be nice to the people who saved her ungrateful ass from a giant sea worm thing. Then we're introduced to Captain Elendil, who's a sea guardsman apparently. After the camera gawps at his ruggedly handsome mug for a bit, we then cut to his son on a boat in some sort of seafaring cult who chant, "The sea is always right!" at the ocean, who then meets a budget Emma Watson with an ulce, who seems to be his sister. He tells the Black Lady Queen that he saved Gladders because the sea put her in his path, and the sea is always right. The sea is always right! Anyway, she accuses him of treason for saving an elf from drowning and asks him to do a service in return. Which, if this was Game of Thrones, I'd be expecting a bloody orgy to break out right about now. Back in the Southlands, the elfie Don Lemon with one facial expression is still doing hard labour in a camp, where a bunch of ugly creatures are hiding from the morning sunlight. Sounds like my lazy teenage cousins on our family trip to Butlins. But anyway, another elf whose name I can't remember but looks suspiciously like Crassus out of Spartacus goes all eco-tree hugger and asks the orcs if they can dig around the giant fuck-off roots rather than spend weeks ripping them out. He soon earns his company a water ration by standing up to the orcs, who then slash the neck of the other elf whose name I can't remember, because reasons. And he dies pretty instantaneously, despite losing the least amount of blood in television history. And then that Lemon Don gives in and cuts down the ancient tree like a riot cuck. Back at Numenor, Gladys flirts with Elendil about escaping a place she ain't even prisoner in, and after playfully threatening to turn her in, she sticks a knife to his stomach and unironically says, "Don't you know who I am?" In a roundabout way, of course. She then channels the feelings of the audience by moaning that she's hated by all who sees her, and then he flirts even more by chatting her up in her own elfie language, which makes her Muffy all wet and puffy.
Did you say ride?
And after the cringiest slow-mo horse riding sequence in television history, what also looks like some sort of maxi-pad advert, Elendil shows off his collection of fancy artwork to Gladders, who recognises the symbol as a map of the Southlands, and it's talking about plans to create a chaotic realm where evil thrives. No, not Chicago, but probably setting up the foundation of Mordor, I imagine. The toxic masculine man, however, avoids getting into beef by buying all the blokes around the drinks and ingratiating himself into the community by being extremely affable, and although they still beat him up afterwards, at least he friggin' tried. Something clearly lost on that elf girl what rubs everyone up the wrong way every single bloody time. Then there's some more cringy slow-mo with the Harfoots prancing around the forest in budget costumes because reasons. And somehow even more culty chanting.
Nobody goes off trail.
And nobody walks alone.
Even though the lead Harfoot girl spent the first 2 episodes doing exactly that. Then Lenny Henry gives a random speech about how some of their tribe has died, whilst fat-shaming a poor bloke. He then spends 5 minutes reading out the names of all the silly sods what died by getting stuck in snow and swimming in landslides, like it's the In Memoriam segment from the Emmys, only with marginally sillier wigs. But anyway, Then the giant guy is revealed, and the tribe admonish female Frodo for hiding a massive strange man in their camp for weeks. The old lady elder lady is particularly unimpressed, and states, any half-foot that breaks the law is to be decaravaned, which is no joke. Last time I got decaravaned it was because I dropped a steaming deuce on the log flume and promptly got a lifetime ban from Centre Parks. How was I supposed to know that ain't where you're meant to drop your logs? That's bloody false advertising to me. Then we catch back up with Captain Elendil and his two sprogs, Isildur and Arion, and the budget Emma Watson proudly announces she got accepted into the Builders Guild, where presumably she's going to spend the rest of her career being wolf whistled by a small gammon in a hard hat, screaming "Yes we can" at the top of his lungs. Anyway, Gladys then visits Halbrand in jail and tells him he can be some sort of king, because she found a scroll from the Hall of Law with the same symbol what he has. Shame the writers didn't check Tolkien's Hall of Law IRL before starting to write this show. And then she tells him their destinies are entwined, or something. Then back at the Orky Gulag, the show goes all pro-communism, and as the workers of the camp rise up and unite by doing some ludicrous chain foo and exposing the orcs to sunlight. So naturally, they release a giant feral hog creature, what looks a bit like Steve Buscemi did the mocap. But unfortunately, they send a woman to do a man's work and she gets instantly killed before even getting a licking. But luckily, the super nimble first black elf with one facial expression manages to take it on and win single-handedly because plot armour. And then that Crassus bloke manages to free himself, but instantly gets taken out by a single arrow, and the episode ends with the elves back where they started. Just minus a few red shirts, what no one really cared about anyway. So there you go. That's the plot and that's your lot. Consider ringing that bell thing so you don't miss parts 4 to 6 when they drop. Say hello in the comments if you have time, and I'll see you in the next one.